Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Breen, and thanks very much for coming. A couple of housekeeping things. This session is being recorded, so please don't ask any questions that are too difficult. And secondly, the folks in charge of SSP were kind enough to give us an extra bag of Garrett's popcorn, so we're going to, as a panel, evaluate you, and whoever seems the most genuinely interested during the entire presentation and asks the best questions will be awarded the popcorn. Yeah, bonus points already right here. So this has been a fun panel to prepare for. We've all admitted to each other that we've learned from each other in the journey we've taken. The idea for this began during a session at the Charleston conference. There was a discussion going on primarily between academic librarians, university librarians, and scholarly publishers. And the facilitator at one point said, well, I'm just an intermediary. To which someone in the audience proclaimed, well, we're all intermediaries. And it was one of those moments where it was very interesting to me. I've been doing this for 20 years. And it's one of those things that seems so simple and so obvious, but you take it for granted. You don't think about it every day. And so what I thought would be interesting is to assemble a group of folks who are part of trying to bring scholarly communications to researchers and focus first on a common objective, something that we all are aspiring to do, so something that we have in common. And then from that, identify common challenges related to that. And in the spirit of, if we focus on what we have in common, the idea being that we can probably help each other solve some of these challenges. And so we've had a fascinating journey. Each of the panelists is going to introduce themselves and then talk about how they link to the common objective. And then please feel free to ask questions at any point. We've designed this in a way that we should have plenty of time at the end for an engaging dialogue as well. And I think that's everything. I'll turn it over to Matt.
Sure. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? So how was lunch? Beautiful weather outside. Has anyone been outside? Yeah, like you're right on the river. So welcome to Chicago. My name is Matt Regis from DePaul University right here in Chicago. I'm originally from New Orleans, but after 8 years, eight Chicago winters, I would say I feel like I'm local. It's been a pleasure to have this planning conversation and get to share this with you all today. I think the common bound, when I think about the common bound, is everyone, so I published or edited 4 different books, 4 different publishers. So Emerald Publishing, Palgrave Macmillan, Crown Business, some more trade books, and then Prima Publishing. And when I think about that experience over the past 15 years or so of editing or publishing books, everyone you see up here is part of this ecosystem. You have to have a librarian, you have to have fantastic publishing partners, you have to have database and ebook aggregators and vendors. And I think we're all bound by a common purpose that we all want to publish great work, right, that actually makes an impact on society and in the classroom, and I think outside of the classroom as well. Most recently, I co-edited a book that was published by Emerald Publishing. They're right in the front row. They're great to work with. And that book was Mastering Business for Strategic Communicators. So I'm a public relations professor at DePaul University and very focused on how do you raise the level of business literacy or acumen for really non-business people, for liberal arts and communication majors. Before academia, the other thing I would touch on is I actually worked in online publishing back when things like blogging and podcasting was new and quaint, which I tell that to my students and they can't imagine a world that wasn't a broadband, the whole idea of dial-up to them as they never experienced. So I'm gonna leave things right there, but this was, I think about planning this and putting this together and being in these conversations. What a great panel, unbiased, that we have here today.
Well, I think I said in one of the lead-up phone calls, as a publisher, I would like to clone Matt and have his understanding of the marketing aspect of what we do as publishers. I wish everyone or more people that we work with had that. So I'm Leila Salisbury. I'm the director of the University Press of Kentucky. I've been working in publishing for 25 years now, starting as an administrative assistant, cycling through marketing departments, acquisitions, and then directing 2 different mid-sized university presses. So I think I've done everything in some ways except typesetting, designing the books, which has been incredibly useful to me, particularly the stint in marketing, to kind of echo that theme, because one of the things I realized in coming up into publishing through the marketing, and you don't have the luxury of keeping a very closed in-house view. In marketing, you have to be looking out what happens to this book or this content when it leaves our hands. And so I think many of the roles then that I've had after that time have been informed by a much more customer-centric view, which I think is increasingly, especially in the electronic age, incredibly important and critical to the business success. So I think my common role in all this, it's something of a midwife, I guess. At university presses, we're networking with scholars, writers, going to conferences, acquiring manuscripts, also in acquiring, and acquiring is something I've seen change because increasingly it is informed by the marketing end of things, or in our acquisitions groups, one of the questions that we should start the conversation about a particular project with is, who is the audience for this book, and how are they served by this project, and then are we the right publisher to get this content to that intended audience? So that question always informs my thinking about it, and so in developing and working with authors for this content, we're creating publication plans that meet the need of the book, disseminating it as broadly as possible, and doing all this while trying to understand changing user habits, and dealing with the technology related to the discoverability and dissemination, but also the university presses are in the unique position of both being a business that has to deal, in the ecosystem with commercial partners who are truly, for-profit or other nonprofit businesses, but also we're part of the academy, which often thinks about finances and investment in different ways, though maybe less so as things are developing. So, we really are very dependent on authors, content creators for this, but we are also dependent then on the other end on the aggregators and then the libraries. So we're the refiner of the diamond, and yet ultimately, we pass it on to these other partners for discovery. So.
Very good. My name is Ken Breen, and I'll be representing aggregators and vendors that sit in between the publishers and the libraries. And I serve as Vice President of Product Management for EBSCO eBooks. I've been in publishing for 20 years, 15 of those years directly involved in roles related to ebooks. And that includes as product development manager for Polk City Directories. I was responsible for migrating our ebooks from diskette to CD-ROM. And at Gale, I was involved in the due diligence and the acquisition of the B2C scholarly platform Questia, and also spent 6 years involved in building the publishing partner program for Gale's virtual reference library. And I'm in my 8th year as product manager for EBSCO eBooks. When it comes to the common goal of discoverability, there's 2 things that we focus on as an aggregator. One is ensuring that the ebooks are discoverable in acquisition portals such as Oasis and Gobi. These are the sites where many university librarians look for and acquire books and ebooks. So we've got to make sure the books are discoverable there. And then secondly, because we have a platform, we need to make sure that those same books are discoverable once they're chosen by a librarian, that they're actually discoverable in the end user research experience. And that discoverability can happen by a researcher coming directly to our product, but it's very common that it'll happen as a result of the user coming through the library catalog or the give you a search engine that the library has implemented. So we're responsible for that. Gregory.
Excellent. My name is Gregory Heald. I'm the Associate Dean of Libraries at the University of Northern Colorado. You perhaps are not familiar with my institution. We're about an hour north of Denver. We're a Carnegie R2 institution, to sort of give you a position where I'm coming from in terms of budgets and interests. We have several nationally known and recognized doctoral programs, and potentially we may soon be adding an entire new college to our institution, which presents some interesting collection development questions to be grappled with. In terms of the context of sitting on this panel, I've been working in collection development, in library collection development, for 20 years or so. And in my current role, I'm in charge of the allocation and expenditures that we have for library materials, either through my librarians that work with particular departments, or increasingly, as I'll elaborate on later, through sort of centralized decisions that I'm making with a core team now. In terms of a common goal, I would say that discoverability from the library's point of view has shifted rather dramatically in the last several years, and with the advent of heterogeneous systems of discovery, so for example, library discovery layers that have been referenced, and other online pathways that lead to library collections, the questions that we're confronted with have become markedly more complex. In one case, in one way, the rich and full integration into library discovery layers, products like Primo or Summon, has led in many libraries to an increased use of ebooks at the chapter download level. The availability of full text in those tools really seems to be one of the driving factors, but it is particularly visible in STEM fields in terms of the number of chapter downloads that I'm getting reports back out on. The other issue that I would point to as a common interest is this issue of other paths to discovery for the ebook itself. Exposure through Google is certainly possible, and many of us are working in the library community with OCLC/schema.org and or BibFrame in some cases to connect users with our collections. Even now, with the nascent aspect of some of those projects, our data shows users finding publisher book content through really quite unexpected and, frankly, in some instances, inexplicable web paths.
So Matt, you want to talk about some of our challenges?
Yep. So one thing in our planning calls to put this together, we've discussed now sort of what's a common bound or goal that brings us together. And then we had some fascinating discussions around some common challenges. So we thought we might touch on some of those common challenges. The first thing I would say it's interesting is I feel I'm sort of the semi-outsider to this group. It's just learning the language, right? So I help communicators learn the language of business. And when you step into this world of scholarly publishing, there's a lingo of even things like we talked about, Ken, even like OER. I had to think for a second, like, OER. Because you never want to be that person to ask the question, right? Like, what does that mean again, right? So that's been fun to be part of this, to sort of learn the language. We just did a survey recently. I saw it to Paul that was on OERs that the library put out there. And I'm like, I know what OERs are now because of this panel. Let's talk a little bit about common challenges. So discoverability, you know, when I write books, I want them to have an impact. And, you know, I don't want it to just be on a CV, right, and help me with tenure and promotion. I want to get it in the hands of other colleagues, professors, and students, and in my case also professionals. And so discoverability is really critical, and it's something that I think until you're an academic that publishes a book, and I did books, you know, 10 and 15 years ago, and now 2 books in the past couple of years, the game has really changed. And I didn't fully appreciate how books get found, beyond Amazon and a book website or my own efforts, but the importance of how you navigate and make it found and visible through discovery on a library website. Things like, I didn't realize that some commercial publishers and scholarly publishers have packages, right, and make your ebook available through a library. That was something that admittedly was sort of an educational process for me to learn about, that then I was thankful that I chose a publisher that has some of those relationships and is in that business. So discoverability is something that admittedly as a author and an editor was something I had to be educated on. I didn't realize how important things were like metadata and book titles and subtitles and sort of search terms and keywords, right? I think the thing is, though, my background is marketing and PR and advertising, so as soon as I learned that that's kind of how the game is played, okay, tell me what I need to do so I can help kind of best support it. In our world, we'd call that search engine optimization or SEO, so it was interesting to have those sort of discussions. The other thing I would touch on that's just an interesting takeaway, so I teach undergraduate students and then graduate students at DePaul here, and I thought that they would be predominantly ebook purchasers, and that's not what I found actually. I actually think it's like 70-30 just based on my classes, that they actually want to have like a physical, I didn't bring my books to shill today, they want to have a real book, and I've asked them about that, why is that? And they've said, well, it's real and I don't get distracted, right? I don't have like a device or like it's not on an e-reader or there's not other stuff there. So I think that's, I've been excited about ebooks and online going back 20 years to, when I was a 20-something and like the beginning of sort of .com stuff. But it's interesting that Gen Z still sees a value in a mix of print as well as ebooks. The other thing I was going to touch on that Leela has talked some about is content value, right? So that's one of the challenges of defining the value of content. And I think one of the things that maybe gives me an advantage in some ways is, increasingly, I think everyone up here is going to be market driven, and everyone in this audience, right? Even if you're with a nonprofit, higher ed is in an era of sort of cost cutting, right? And tightening the belt, at least at my institution. And so one of the things that I think authors are going to have to think more about is what's their platform, right? So how can they make a business case to Leela of, I have an audience and I actually have some ways where I can help you sell this book and be a true partner. And I think that's sacrilege for some of my colleagues, right? I'll just tell you, even my own college, it's not what they want to be in, right? They want to publish awesome books, put it on their Vita, and then other people are going to do that work. And I don't think that's the world that we're kind of in now or heading increasingly towards. Another observation would be around data. It was interesting in our planning calls, we all talked about data. And in my classes, we're always focused on data-driven decision-making as communicators. And what I've observed, at least as an outsider, an interloper into this field, is I think we all want to have access to more data in a timely way, but there's different reasons why we're not getting access to it as much as we might want. And I've even learned it's interesting, and that's one reason why it depends on who you work with and who your publishing partner is, because I have a publisher now that's been very responsive with providing access to what they can share. But I've even done workarounds like Amazon's Author Central, if you're familiar with, so I can sign up there, I can get access to Nielsen book scan data on a delayed basis. I love data, right? I love to know, like, if I'm doing a speaking engagement or writing something to promote the book, like, did it move the needle? Or if someone tells me they adopted the book at USC, right, do I see geographically through the Nielsen book scan data that they're actually buying books, right, in Southern California? So that's been interesting. I think, like, one way you can motivate authors is provide them with more timely access. There's an education process to data, and I'm gonna pass things over from there to Leela.
All right, so I'll talk a little bit about discoverability I think increasingly with publishers, because there's this flood of content, there is no shortage of scholarly information and content out there, so consumers have a lot of choices. And I think one of the things, that as university presses, we try to think about, okay, what then in this ecosystem, what is it that we bring in particular to it? And thinking about, gatekeepers is not a positive word, though really I think in the sense that we do it, it is, university presses are often associated with trusted, vetted, accurate content. When working with students, if they do a Google search for various content, how do you distinguish between multiple information sources about a topic? One thing that I think sometimes presents a real challenge to university presses as opposed to commercial academic publishers is thinking about the fact that, most of us outside of, the big 6 or 8 university presses, we don't have specialized employees or vast tech infrastructures that really allow us to strategically augment the discoverability of our content in the way that I think we realize we need to be doing. We rely often on authors or junior staff in-house to be writing those all-important, abstract and keywords. We've been talking a lot in-house about chapter-level A&Ks based on the information we're hearing from libraries about how, single chapter downloads, eclipsing, full book use. So how does that tie into discovery? And if we put, more of that granular metadata out there, will that help? So without kind of some of this infrastructure and participating in that, we suffer, I think, in the search algorithms. And I think part of this is just for decades, university press, it was kind of a cottage industry. It totally focused on the editorial aspect and nurturing scholarship, and that still all very much happens, but since the finances, honestly, of the ecosystem has very much changed. We don't rely on word of mouth or book reviews for discovery or course adoption in the same way. A lot of it is use-driven by these search engines. So increasingly, we have to solve the problem of, how do we compete when this is the case? And that sort of segues into standards and normalizations. So this enhanced discovery basically depends on common standards and metadata. But I think, certainly with university presses and maybe with commercial academic publishers, I'd love to hear from you all about that. There are some standards in place, but I feel like there are still huge challenges for this. BISAC codes are still not structured in a way that I think helps with really granular, very specific kinds of discovery. We have Onyx feeds, but I realize, especially in talking with my co-panelists, there's so many steps that we still have to go. I came into this thinking, how do one of our vendors requires us to do A&Ks at the chapter level, and so we've been, collecting this, and I said, we've got to get it into the metadata feed we're sending out. Won't this help discovery? And so I then asked, we use CoreSource to disseminate our metadata. And I said, are tons of people asking for this, abstract and keyword at the chapter level? And they said, no, we don't distribute that for you. I'm like, why not? Wouldn't this build discovery? And they said, well, no, none of the people we send your metadata to have asked for it or seem to want it. So that was an interesting discovery, and I'm still sort of trying to unpack why don't they want it if what we're hearing from the library is, use is very much at the chapter level, and so what needs to happen to get this part of the metadata to be more activated and to make its way through the channels. So I talked to our IT person who does a great job in disseminating our metadata, and so I just asked him kind of, what's your take on all this? And, I'll just quote him here. He said, quote, "A search of the major websites, Google, Barnes & Noble, and Amazon, indicates to me that they are not even capturing our title keywords, let alone the chapter level data." So that was disturbing, and again, we're only one small piece. I don't know how I individually can affect this larger ecosystem, but I think it gets to another common point that we talked about, where we all have a lot of misconceptions about what is happening with metadata and discovery, and we think things are happening that are clearly not, and so how do we find out what's not happening, and then what do we do about that? And thinking about, we're at Kentucky, a small to mid-sized university press, so thinking about our own group of university presses there, and, Ken mentioned they're widely differing capabilities that we have. So we may be collecting A&Ks, another press our size, may not be doing that. And, sometimes I'll ask colleagues, are you doing this? And I say, no, we just, we're a skeleton staff. We don't have anybody to put to this. We work with vendors who are still sort of getting print PDFs submitted to them. So I realize our trading partners that we work with aren't even getting standard information from all the clients they're working with, or there aren't these standardized formats. So from the publisher end, I will say the pain point on standards, the major vendors we work with, the array of individual requirements and things that our trading partners want is dizzying. So, and for, again, a smaller publisher, they're really time-consuming and expensive. Amazon requires a special flavor of EPUB that we have to, pay extra for a completely separate conversion of. Instead of accepting a standard Onyx feed, some of our vendors still require these very complex and individualized Excel spreadsheets that have to be customized each season. We have a vendor who requires proprietary XML conversion that we pay for, but then can't, get the information, the XML version back on. So, I realize there's a lot of time and money that we put into massaging all these different formats. And I would welcome kind of greater standardization with that. And again, all this runs back to data, and I wish we could get more of it. Again, I don't know if this is our size, or we're still all trying to figure out, who owns what data and what data do we share. I find it interesting that at the moment, as publishers, we need to best know our customers and what they want and how they're using it. I feel very cut off from that data because I joke, and this is nothing about EBSCO, but I often joke that our content gets sent into the black hole of the aggregator, and I don't know what happens to it. It comes out the library, and the library may say, I got a multiplier on this, or the things happen to our content and the pricing through these paths. And again, the publisher doesn't necessarily have control over that. But what I would love to get back is more of the granular user data, and then thinking about the kind of editorial work that we do, especially if it is very market-oriented, having this data of, what is there a chapter in a particular book that's getting 80% of the downloads of use of this book? So clearly that's a topic that there is information needed on. It really would shape how we think about the content and what content we're actively acquiring. We, since we are a smaller publisher, we don't have our own platform, so we don't have this kind of direct-to-consumer sales that we can depend on to get information that would help direct either the editorial or the commercial part of what we're doing. Pretty much what we get from any vendors is enough information to pay royalties, so we can assign, the income to the correct book, and a lot of times that's sort of where it stops. And so again, if there are things we can do as partners to really get our hands on better, more organized data, and I think we'll talk more about this because I've asked librarians, and I said, well, could we work with you to get use information, and that would help us again better direct our efforts. And I'll wrap up quickly. Content value. One of the questions that came up during our discussions. Are the way things developing in this ecosystem commoditizing peer-reviewed university press content or scholarly content? And my answer to that was absolutely. I don't blame libraries; they are suffering the same shrinking budgets that university press publishers are. But when scholarship becomes purchased kind of based on use and these kind of use and discovery triggers, the bulk of that use probably will come from publishers who have the money and infrastructure to invest a lot in discoverability and metadata. So it becomes the self-perpetuating cycle. A librarian can say, well, the content from this platform, by publisher X got all this use. I got the data. I can show the administrators this was a good purchase. This is a good investment for us because this is being used. And I think the danger for smaller publishers is, how do we compete with that? So, can we work together to get our content in such a way where, the purchases are justified?
So for the aggregator, some of the challenges with discoverability, and I'm going to kind of synthesize some of this so that we have plenty of time for Greg. So metadata is the vehicle to making sure that a book is discoverable, that it's relevant, that it's available, and that we get it to market in a timely manner. Onyx is the standard for communicating through the ecosystem. And Onyx is well-defined, it's time-tested, and it's very complicated. I'm going to give two simple examples that we discovered through our talks that were kind of an eye-opener for all of us. Leela kind of mentioned the chapter-level abstracts. So here you've got an author and a publisher spending a lot of time to create chapter-level abstracts, and then they're assuming that that information is making its way downstream and helping the researcher in the library. And one of the things that we realized is that even though there's 4 parts of the ecosystem on this panel, there are folks, vendors, agents that sit between Matt and Leela. There are publisher services vendors that sit between the publisher and the aggregator. She mentioned CoreSource, how we communicate this data downstream. There are systems and processes that sit between an aggregator and the library. We mentioned Oasis and Gobi for book selection, and we mentioned the discovery engines to the end user. So this panel is not comprehensive of all of the ways that information changes hands. So when you put all that work into creating what you believe is information that's going to help you get more books sold and discovered, the first thing that you have to do is skip one level and talk to the next level downstream and ask each of the platforms that are involved in disseminating your ebooks for sale what they can and can't take advantage of. And then when you find some that can take advantage of it, you, the publisher, have to tell the publisher services vendor to turn that switch on to those aggregators. It doesn't matter what we ask the publisher services vendor for. The contract is between them and the publisher. So only the publisher can give them that instruction. Okay? And I'll use another quick example, dates. There's lots of dates in Onyx fields. The one that we picked on for our discussion was the on-sale date. So when you put an on-sale date in your Onyx feed, we honor that date. We will receive your ebook and your metadata, and we will process it, and it will sit until that on-sale date arrives. And so from time to time, we audit the market, and we notice that some platforms may have the book available ahead of us. And so we'll contact the publisher, and we'll say, we're honoring your on-sale date. Did you intend for us to hold the book until that date? Do you intend for all of us to hold it, or do you not intend for us to hold it? And not all publishers are created equally. Some of you will say, yes, we absolutely want you to honor that date, and we'll make sure everybody's honoring it. And some will say, oh, no, we don't intend that to be for ebooks. Go ahead and just, when you get the book, make it available for sale. So the important takeaway there is we need to make sure that these Onyx fields that are well-defined and understood are actually understood between us in each instance. And if we don't, then we have a disconnect in what's really expected by the publisher and what we're doing as aggregators. As far as content value, we work to bring the good peer-reviewed content to the top of search results, both in the acquisition platforms and in the end-user platforms. And part of the job of the vendors that sit between us and the library, in addition to some metadata that we may add to the book distributors add Library of Congress classifications and subject headings. They'll add certain proprietary fields that are important to librarians and so forth. So we're helping to improve the discoverability downstream by adding data that you may or may not have added as well. Gregory?
Excellent, thank you. So, for the purposes of this panel, I'm going to say that libraries are seeking data for user experience optimization, analytics, and promotion and tenure purposes, and selection purposes. For the user experience, I don't have a good or a precise ebook example to give you, but I would say that we're seeking interoperability and standards-based solutions so the extensions to our services are easy to implement, and one might think of the library as providing information in one particular direction, but what comes to mind for me is thinking about data that we have acquired from Clarivate, Web of Science, for example, and being able to provide that into our faculty data system on campus, which drives a whole host of other operations that we have. For selection or acquisitions, we're seeking data that exposes user needs that have become significantly less apparent to us in collection development in the last 10 or 15 years. With exclusively tangible collections, we might have used, for example, circulation data, direct patron feedback, focus groups with faculty to help guide our purchasing and acquisition decisions. The uptake on all of those has diminished in the last 15 years, and we're increasingly relying on determining patron needs and expectations on the data that we're receiving from whether or not it's a counter-compliant data point or something that we're getting out of Google Analytics. But it has to come to us in an aggregated, in a different form than we used to get it. I also would mention that having been through the changes that we experienced in libraries related to journals, I would say that right now I'm experiencing something very similar in terms of ebook content. So we're talking a lot about sort of exposure in Gobi or some other acquisitions discovery system that the librarians are using to make individual firm order decisions about a particular title. But increasingly where I'm spending a larger and larger portion of my budget, and I know this is the case for many of my other academic colleagues, that we're spending more of a larger percent of our budget in purchasing large packages of books. So they're coming in as large packages, or we're trying to figure out in terms of where to expose things in terms of patron-driven acquisition. We're utilizing something like a book rental service, and then drawing inferences from what part of the LC classification scheme people are seemingly getting some value in content and downloading ebook content, oftentimes backlist material, and then opening up front list material in our PDA or making other purchasing decisions based on that data point. But again, we're looking for data in very different ways than we were able to get it more directly 15 or so years ago. Yeah, so in terms of content value, I would just say that we in the libraries recognize that that the scholarly presses play an essential role in the promotion and tenure process, and it's part of our general mission to support the university's desires in P&T, and we need that infrastructure to survive and thrive. So, given the analytical, technical, and marketing power that's been described that happens to be in the hands of some of the very largest publishers right now, libraries, in my case, as a collection development officer, I have to make sure that we continue to support learned societies, university presses, that may not necessarily have the technical or staffing resources to optimize their content so that it shows up in the discovery layer, which then drives a statistical decision-making portion of my decision-making based on the statistical behavior of our users. So this is especially important in considering what our overall collection strategy is, since that data available in the attendant decision-making has the potential to derive even more homogeneous collections across academic libraries. And given the keynote speech that we heard last night here at SSP, we in libraries are conscious of this challenge, and we register it, and we're looking for ways that we can partner with our colleagues in other portions of this ecosystem to ensure that we don't end up with collections that are not representative.
All right, so Matt, you're going to run us home here. We committed each other that we would each do something with our learnings on this journey, and so we've each got a couple of takeaway commitments.
So an observation real quick would be listening to this conversation, just thinking about the composition of faculty, right, in the U.S. today, right, and we're moving more to term faculty in a lot of places, thinking about my own colleagues, right, and not so much tenure line or tenure track colleagues, and so I would put out there with the room that may have longer term implications in terms of university presses and the vital role that played in tenure and promotion, right? And in terms of being viewed as like really kind of the gold standard. So I think that's just something interesting to think about, because I made notes here. Gregory talked about patron-driven acquisition, right, which is kind of saying market-driven. Leela, you talked about audience-driven sort of earlier and wanting to get more access to data to show like what are my audience, my potential readers actually interested in. And so I think that is something that, as much as I'm someone who's market-driven myself, there is a societal value to niche, what I'd call niche knowledge or more vertical knowledge. And so I think everyone in the room, and Gregory touched on this too, that's going to be a challenge, I think, in the years ahead of how do we continue to justify the publication and support of knowledge that's really important, but maybe doesn't have a very big audience sort of behind it. So that's just something, taking my business hat off and just sort of the contributing to society hat, that's like a challenge, I think, for everyone in this room. To get back to my two sort of takeaways would be discoverability. I would encourage publishers, and maybe librarians can help with this too, they're great partners at DePaul on campus, to educate us more about things like metadata and keywords. It's just something that we don't necessarily know about. We spend so much time researching and writing these books that we don't always think about, like, holy smokes, this is going to be really important with actually being able to discover our work after we spent maybe years on actually writing and researching a book. And then the second part would just be ROI, right? So return on investment. And this is kind of sticky because it's not always in academia. We're not always the most business-minded folks, and we don't always like to hear about sort of capitalist-driven ways to doing things. But I think that came across this panel today was sort of access to data and making things more market-driven and justifying decision-making, whether you're a publisher or you're a librarian making acquisition decisions or you're an ebook aggregator. So I think that ties to data. I think that's another theme that sort of came away from our discussions. And then the last thing I would say is just to remind everyone in this room that you guys do something that's a very honorable and noble world that you're in of scholarly publishing. And I think it's needed more than ever, right, of kind of where we sit today with a lot of things going on, right, out there and the sort of the swirl. And so I wish you could sit and see like my students as they digest a book or a brown bag lunch with colleagues, right, talking about like a new book and debating kind of research and theory. And so I think, I'd say you're always welcome to my classes, right? Because I think sometimes that's the best way to kind of remind yourself, because we all sit in different parts of the ecosystem, the impact you actually have on professors and have on students.
Right. When I was thinking about, what I would like to see, originally I'd written my notes, encouraging our major vendors to expand their Onyx ingestion fields. And, hearing Ken talk, I realized I need to be sort of pointing that finger back at ourselves, the publisher. because I think we take too much for granted, and the onus then clearly is on us to talk to our middle people about what fields we're submitting and what's actually getting used, and turning off and on the right kinds of things. That was a huge takeaway for me, and that I think we do have some more control over it. I think there's some larger ecosystem conversations we can be having. If Google, if all the major fields that I listed off the quote, from our IT person, if that's still a huge breakdown, that is something that in some ways segues into my second point in, talking about data with our larger professional associations, whether it's, SSP, the Association of University Presses, and the ARL, is there a joint project that we can be working on together with the BISG, or something, again, to just provide more clarity for everybody about, what these metadata fields mean, a standard, interpretations of an on-sale date, and also seeing what we can do with aggregators and library partners to get more data, use data that's meaningful back to the publishers, so that we can do a better job in helping the libraries make the best use of the resource spends that they do have.
The key takeaway for me as an aggregator is that data feeds do not replace human communication. It was a real learning thing. I had to do a lot of work internally to take some of the topics we discussed and then go get educated about them internally. And my friend Kari Paulson is here from ProQuest, and big aggregators like us, we ingest as many as 1,500 books on a given day. And so it's critical that the data feeds are coming in accurately, timely, and as you intend them to come in. Mm-hmm. So the key takeaway for me is I'm going to encourage Leela to have the person that is sending the feeds to CoreSource talk to our content management team who receives it, so that they can make sure there's a common understanding of date fields, and that the information that you believe we're getting or we should be getting, we are getting. And I'm going to encourage those two folks to, in turn, talk to the book distributors and make sure that that same information is making it from the aggregator into the acquisition portals. And so I think, in addition to just having a business audit where we talk about how much sales were and royalties and so forth, we actually go a little step into that data, make sure that data is right, because you can do all that extra work and still not have your book on sale if we don't get the dates right.
So, following up on that remark, I would say that what I've experienced in our conversation today is that first, candor among the various partners that are involved in this process is really essential. And oftentimes we speak obliquely and unclearly when we have a pain point, and from the point of view of the library, understanding what the value proposition and the business model that our partners in the book trade are engaging in is helpful, so that we can tune our activities and our understanding of what they're trying to do. We can be better partners in that way. The other thing that I would say is that, and this is more directed at the other intermediaries between the author and the library, folks really do need to understand, if the library market is an important part of your business, you really do have to understand the ways in which library budgets have changed. And it's not necessarily the specific dollar figures, but actually the kinds of dollars that we have. So the total amount is important, but understanding the difference between a capitalized expenditure versus a non-capitalized expenditure, understanding how services get rolled up into a budget and shown to a board of trustees, in my case, and what that means to them. So those pressure points that I experience actually really do either they make it, in some cases, more possible for me to make certain kinds of purchases than others, and I think that that's frequently invisible to many of the folks that are in the middle.
We have a couple minutes left for questions. The session's being recorded, so we're asked to bring microphones out to you if you have a question. So we'll run out there. Fire away. Yeah, you want to go over there? Yep.
Thank you for that. I had a question maybe for the panel, but specifically for the librarian. Do you see a future for qualitative seeing a selection process? What I mean is the approval plan driven sort of selection process that still is to some extent involved in ebooks, obviously always for print, how you're using Gobi, or are you seeing a shift really to quantitative measures? Thank you.
It's an excellent question. So actually our approval plans now really do drive, in many cases, and including mine, what we're exposing for patron-driven acquisitions. So in terms of firm orders from a selector or from a particular faculty member, we've seen those diminish, at least at the kind of university that I'm at. And furthermore, because of the data that's available to me, I would say that we will draw parameters using qualitative factors like profiling from Gobi to help inform the data that we're seeing. But that said, the pressure is really much like it was with e-journals 10 years ago to make decisions at a much for much larger dollar figures, and those that understand and figure that out are probably going to get more dollars from libraries in the future.
So, question for Gregory. You talked about the kind of myriad of ways that your users and researchers are finding content outside of just the discovery layers and the catalog. There was a library that I spoke to. It's really stuck with me. This was a couple of years ago in Fremantle in West Australia. It was Notre Dame. And they said that increasingly their researchers weren't aware that a publication existed, and they were talking probably more a little bit about journal articles and books, but unless they were hearing about it from their colleagues on Twitter, and that Twitter was increasingly becoming a sort of marketing engine or discovery engine for content. I wonder if you see any impact of social media, Twitter or other, in that sort of discovery process.
I would say that at my university, I've not detected it in terms of, I mean, certainly if something is mentioned in social media, or in our case is mentioned on NPR on the drive-in in the morning, it's likely that we're going to get a firm order request from somebody on campus by the end of the day. But in terms of, you know, the size of like the total operation that we have, that is an important thing to do, and we're very pleased and happy to respond to those requests, but they're small in the context of the overall budget that we're trying to manage. So we wish to fulfill those needs, but trying to also figure out how to build a balanced collection overall is, at least from my kind of institution, not going to be met by patron or selection requests that arise from Twitter or other social media.
I'm just curious to jump in there because I was at a journals workshop yesterday where this question came up, and somebody had asked some of the journal publishers, you know, how are you tracking this? Are you seeing correlation? And everyone admitted that they felt it was a factor that really was beginning to influence things, but it was so squishy, you know, where you follow, you know, it kind of goes back to the question of authenticity in social media. If you're following an author, scholar, you know, journal editor with a lot of gravitas, and it's another, you know, then, you know, whatever they're pushing in terms of content or mentioning, you know, does get the increased use. But I think it's another case where the publisher, you know, we don't have control over that, or it's something we concede, but then it takes on a life of its own. And so I don't know that we could entirely track how much of what's at the end of the day happening in the library. It may be much larger than we think, but again, there sort of aren't the measures to make that connection yet.
It seems there's one more connection between you and you, and that's you to the end user,
Yeah.
right? And a little marketing kind of, that goes a long way as well. But it's, you could do all the things right, get your data streams and everything working the way you want it to, and everything makes it in the catalog. But then there's that discovery process, and then there's that, how do you sort of market or make aware these really valuable assets you're spending your money on, and make sure that your users actually know it's there for them.
So part of me wonders if it varies by discipline a little bit. So I think about, I'm connected with colleagues on Facebook or on Twitter who are mostly public relations, strategic communication, and there's been this cultural shift where I think a lot of us have gotten very comfortable with promoting our latest, whether it's a book chapter or a book or a journal article, and it's out there, and we see it, and I do learn about their work sometimes through the social media channels than I do through the confines of a traditional latest issue of an academic journal. But I wonder if that varies some based upon fields, right? So I think in public relations and advertising, we're more comfortable with academics building their own personal brands. But that is a way that I'm learning about more what people are up to than just stumbling upon it through whether it's Google Scholar as an overlay, right? Or going directly to like an EBSCO or ProQuest database.
A couple years ago at Charleston, and I've forgotten the name of the company, it was a British-based company that had done some consulting work for a company, and they said, and I'm still thinking about this figure, that they had determined that 3% of all Facebook posts had a connection to academic content. And 3%, you may think, oh, that's not much, but actually that's probably huge in terms of thinking about the space of Facebook. And so what is that doing, again, in ways that we can't track or chart necessarily?
So we started using Kudos. I don't know if anybody else uses Kudos. So I think the URL is growkudos.com, and when our authors submit papers, we ask them to, in addition to the abstract, put in 140 characters in simple language, what is this paper really about? When the paper is published, they get an email that says your paper's just been published, and it'd be so easy for you to copy and paste your explanation that you wrote 2 years ago, so you don't have to think about it, and put it on your social media. And they could easily copy and paste that into Twitter or their LinkedIn page. And we just started this 2 years ago, and usage is up. So it's a way to push out information, and like I said, they don't have to make it up. They already did when they submitted it, so just an option.
You can increase those characters. Yeah, well, whatever.
So I want to be respectful of the time. It's 3 o'clock. I want to thank Matt, Leela, and Gregory for all of your work and collaboration and leading up to today. And thank you all for your thoughtful questions and for being here. We'll stay for a couple minutes if there's any other questions. And Matt is a PR professor, so he told me before this session that he's going to make sure this is the most tweeted and retweeted session from SSP. So we're pulling for you now. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.